This is Richard Ryan.
And this is Garrett Chaffin-Quiray. And we are the High-Low Bro Show.
Let's do another take.
Okay. This is the High-Low Bro Show, episode 20, Working Girls versus Anora.
Garrett and I operate on the assumption that you've seen the movies in question, meaning that we don't hesitate to go often into great detail.
This is a spoiler zone. I first heard of the movie Working Girls written up in some local newspaper by some kind of gnarly writer whose name I've now forgotten, celebrating the fact that this movie was so far in front of the cultural tide of the middle 1980s in the Reagan era that it was a remarkable thing. For my teen self, going to the local multiplex where I was seeing the likes of Pretty in Pink, I couldn't believe that there was a movie about professional sex workers from the position of professional sex workers with all of the titillating prospects that suggested, from nudity to various forms of coupling and so on. This movie then was a kind of a worm that worked its way down into my brain and sat there for years and years. On top of that, it was a very obscure movie and extremely hard to find. Long way of saying that Working Girls is the story of one 24-hour period in the life of a prostitute who keeps that aspect of her profession on the down low, away from her lover, a woman, who is the mother of a child they seem to share. Most all of the movie's arc happens inside of the duplex apartment in Manhattan, where she takes various clients, engages in various conversations with her fellow workers, and gradually becomes more and more tired as she takes on more and more work at the behest of the madam that runs the place. The point of view character's name is Molly, played by the actress Louise Smith. But that's all this is. The workplace story of a woman who goes to work. But what she does for work is something that 13 or 14-year-old Garrett just couldn't believe was put on film and wanted to see quite desperately, but had to mature fully 40 years before I found a copy and shared it with you, which is what we're now talking about.
Although I'd certainly heard of Working Girls because it has a certain, I think, well-deserved reputation, I had not seen it until you recommended it for our, I guess, what will become known in the future as our prostitution episode. And so I was intrigued and very engaged by the movie. Part of what engages me is the sense that it took an almost neo-realist documentary approach to its subject. There's a very moving scene early where you see Molly getting up, sharing breakfast with her partner, an African-American woman, and the partner's daughter. And there's a cut to Molly's face of her looking at what we would now call her wife with genuine tenderness and open love. It's one of the clearest moments of unveiled emotion in the movie. She's just adoring the woman that she's with.
At the age I was when this movie came out, my only understanding of what prostitution was jokes on certain kinds of cop procedural shows that I was allowed to watch on television, and an occasional dirty joke that might rear its head out in public life, and the way that older boys and sometimes girls would talk, but no real understanding of what that meant. However, I did understand that prostitution was a street-level experience between two people, the buyer of services and the provider of services, in alleyways or other dark places in big cities. This movie reverses that to a degree because it is ensconced inside not a luxurious apartment, but a well-appointed one, with a waiting room, a kitchen, restrooms. It's got towel service. The workers in it, the prostitutes, are expected to provide condoms for their johns. This is all done on the up and up. In fact, the johns often meet one another while making a selection from the available workers on who it is they want to have congress with. But also, the movie works very hard to not glamorize or make rude or disgusting imagery out of what these women are doing. There's a really telling remark from the actress Susan Sarandon. I don't know if it's accurate, but I've memorized it as being, no woman is more important than her bared breasts. Anytime somebody pulls off their top, that is all that you see. And while this movie does have not infrequent glimpses of naked bodies, both male and female, which does upstage part of how the eye and the ear identify the story of this movie, there is no effort made to glamorize these bodies who are engaged in a very common activity. The transaction is very overtly discussed over and over again, each woman with each John, the women among one another about what they're willing to do, jokes they make while filling time. Nothing here looks like it could have come from a glossy magazine, the likes of which Larry Flynt was promoting at this very same time in the middle 80s, to much chagrin on the religious right, if not also on the far progressive left. Meaning this movie is about relatively ordinary people seeking forms of contact they find difficult to find in their life. That's the John. They're regular-ish people. The women are not supermodel beautiful. They're vital-looking 25 to 35-year-olds who are plying the trade of their body. We don't get glamour lighting. We don't get stuff that's draped in all kinds of haze. We don't have things that remove blemishes. In fact, we simply stare, sometimes not all that well in composition, at odd body parts or at objects around the beds, or we watch these women clean up the encounter, put towels away, redress themselves, answer the phone, which they do constantly. One cutaway detail we get a lot of in the movie, watching Molly scribble what she's charged, what she has been paid, which is a ledger she is supposed to keep and then pay out the madam of the place, a woman named Lucy, played by Ellen McElduff. Lucy expects a cut. That's why she provides this apartment for these women to be off the street, protected from riffraff, protected from petty crime, protected from the police, but in exchange, a commission is due at the end of a shift. One of the things the women talk about, using Molly's notebook as a kind of a reference point, is how they're not going to report all of their activities because they want to pocket 100% of the cash as much as they can. Lucy is depicted as a former prostitute who's a bit of a gadfly. She has a guy on a string, her boyfriend, who is a married man who nonetheless is wealthy and enjoys buying her things, but also likes to sample the talent Lucy has amassed in her apartment. Molly simply wants to make a buck and go home. And we watch her ledger get filled out across the day until I think she leaves after the end of what probably is a 12 or 14-hour shift with $900 cash. So that detail speaks to me because I also keep ledgers of my spending and of my earning and what I owe in taxes and when is the electricity bill due. And I could sort of see that's exactly what Molly's doing. She's just willing to divide the time she spends with a given client to achieve an orgasm for him equals this amount of money, which is this much freedom from want.
$900 a day would have been a handsome income. And,
yeah, I suggest that's probably something on par with $3,000 in 2026. So that's real bread. And we have the impression from the way that Molly talks with Lucy and the other women in the apartment that she does not work every day, and that is partly because she's this rare object, a Yaley who's got a particular clientele who enjoy her. There's a winning secondary character who's a kind of contrast that I liked kind of a lot. Her name is Dawn, played by Amanda Goodwin, and she's portrayed as a street hooker who's turned into a prostitute in this kind of an apartment thing. But what she wants to be is a lawyer, so she's going to night school and has to get off shift in order to make night classes. She doesn't say where she's going, but the idea is that she's 21 or 22-ish and wants to be somewhere else by the time she is Molly's age. And Molly's sort of charged by that. Like, that's a good idea. And in that equation, we see a less refined person who's more overt in her language, less skillful in using her words and vocabulary. That is Dawn, is nonetheless trying to become something else. And that is a way to use prostitution as a vehicle for achieving one's eventual goal. Now, this is not the movie I expected to see from when I was a teenager and first reading about it all the way through my...
It's not risky business, and you don't...
No, that's a good connection.
You don't have Rebecca De Mornay stripping down in front of Tom Cruise. What we get is almost a documentary-like feel of what their lives are purportedly like.
we have what I think are some pretty on-the-nose conversational bits sprinkled in the story. For instance, there comes a moment in the afternoon of this one long day when Lucy is interviewing a new prostitute, a black woman. And Lucy explains to her, please don't take offense, but you're likely to earn less than these white women who I've already got on staff. And she explains some of the ins and outs of that, and we watch then as a black male client shows up in the living room receiving area to make a selection on who he wants to have sex with. And indeed, he's hostile to this new worker who racially is like him, but he's not interested in that in any kind of erotic sense. That echoes certain conversations that I have been privy to over the years, certain forms of journalism that I have read, that there is hierarchy in all forms of work, and sex work is no different. And I think that's a kind of a nice thing. It allows us to consider the hierarchies that the rest of life is already invested with, whether it's based on race or class or all of the other isms that we're aware of, but it parks it in the middle of this movie and de-eroticizes the thing that you're thinking you're there to watch, which is a lot of hot people engaged in sex, which is more the world of pornography. While this movie can be accused of being pornographic, we see a condom, for instance, that's been used, wrapped up in tissue paper and thrown away. We don't watch penetrative activity. We just see the after effects. And so we're paying attention to details that are part of human intimacy, at least intimacy that's not supposed to result in children. And that's made the particular area of concern here that work has details, preparation. In this case, it's how you dress, how you undress. In certain instances, these women service men who are kinky and want particular roles to be played through. They want to be dominated. They want to be spanked and so on. And these things are okay in this space. I know that when I was a young person, the notion of kink was like the notion of sexuality itself. Way, way, way a hazard to one's safety. It was not talked about very overtly and considered something shameful. As I have grown older, I've become better at identifying the fact that I am wired through my upbringing and other social habits of coming of age against accepting that people have all kinds of appetites. In its way, from 40 years ago, this movie is opening up position to say that it's not just penises and vaginas that result in sexual activity and satisfaction. There's a range of possibilities. So to that degree, I think this movie is kind of revolutionary, if you like that big R word. It's significantly different than other kinds of things. And I'm so glad you mentioned Risky Business. That was in my experience. By the time Working Girls was released in 1986, this movie works differently.
So there are two signature films about prostitution, and you've got Risky Business and then you've got Pretty Woman, and both of them are totally unlike either of the movies that are under discussion in this podcast, and I think reflect an unfortunately romanticized idea of what the sex works is like. I mean, if you believe Julia Roberts as this high-end escort who doesn't have any obvious psychological or substance abuse issues that led her into a life of prostitution, it's all a Cinderella sort of fairy tale. Working Girls shares almost no genetic material with either Risky Business or Pretty Woman. And Working Girls, again, has this neorealist documentary feeling, which Lizzie Borden, a important and I think underappreciated independent feminist director, she captures it very well.
One thing that does spill out of Working Girls, and I think it's part of how sexuality is addressed in America, is the sense of secrecy. I don't remember the name of the John who shows up partway through the movie, but the gist is he likes to see what new recruits Lucy's putting on the couch that he might select for an assignation. But the thing is, he doesn't want to have sex. He wants to lie in the comfort of being around a new woman to get himself worked up so he'll go home and have sex with his wife. And that suggests that there is a really deep attachment of arousal and desire. But in the example of this one character, which is part of the movie, their purpose, these prostitutes, is getting the boil, but not actually seeing it through. So there could be a counter of whether that actually is prostitution or a form of modeling or a kind of therapy. And I believe it's all of those things, but they do have a kind of a joke about that. Well, why does he come here? Because he's getting ready to go home to his missus. And that's a valuable thing in as much as these women become the deposit points for a variety of fluids, sure, make the joke, but also for all of these inflamed desires of people that they can't adequately communicate with their real-life partners, but still need to communicate it for some reason to come out the other side feeling healthy. The thing that's not particularly well addressed in this movie, and it can't be, it's just the 24 hours in Molly's life, from the alarm clock at 7 a.m. through the next alarm clock at 7 a.m., and that is the impact of absorbing all of this desire and some of the cruelty from some of these Johns on the women themselves. There's a particular coupling that happens in the latter part of the movie where a young man who's a regular of Molly's, who seeks her out and wishes to have a relationship with her outside of the apartment. Paul is creepy because he calls them like siblings and enjoys undressing her after undressing himself and staring at them together while looking in a mirror.
I'll tell you one thing. As long as I'm paying for this, we're not equals.
Well, maybe that's why you come back every week. Maybe that's what makes it interesting for you.
What? That you're a whore?
It's a tough moment, that particular encounter, because it's where we register how these women, through Molly as our point of view character, must absorb whatever weird tension these men who are paying for their time feel they are allowed to share, whether it's welcome or isn't. Clearly, some of the Johns who show up are returnees that the women enjoy and have a good time with. Some of the people who walk in seeking their services are one-offs. One enjoyable person who shows up, I don't know if you caught this, there was an older guy maybe halfway through named Joseph. That's the filmmaker Richard Leacock, who associated himself with the Pennebaker sort of situation in the middle of the 50s and 60s and gave a whole new prominence to direct cinema and documentary in the middle of the last century and lived a bright, long life till his deep 90s.
That both delights me to know, and I am not surprised, because I think that probably as the years go by, working girls will probably be regarded as a very important contribution to, let's call it gonzo. When we look at video images and actors, even if we're not watching real people going through their real lives, if the performers are of a quality, as I think the women in Working Girls are, where they really convince you that, you know, they're in the lives and they're in the personalities, the personae that they're portraying. That's a special kind of thing that cinema is really good at it, because if you see something on film, you're inclined to believe it's true unless it's obviously just written with CGI or various kinds of animation, and you know it's not true, and you know you're watching fantasy. There is a scene, it maybe lasts about 10, 15 seconds early in the film, where you see Molly lying on, I think it's a bathroom floor, trying to assert either a diaphragm or a contraceptive sponge.
Right.
She has a discussion with another girl, and it's maybe the most explicit shot in the entire movie, and it's totally non-sexual. I mean, this movie is made when the AIDS crisis is really getting out of control. I do not believe that AIDS is actually mentioned. Given that Lizzie Borden clearly, with this film, tried to make something very honest and frank and direct about a important universal subculture. I mean, it's not just American.
That's right.
You know, there's a reason why they called if you call prostitution the oldest profession, right? Certainly by 86, and I remember these years well. I think AIDS was well known and various forms of transmission were identified. It's a little bit odd that AIDS isn't included in any of the discussions that the women or the Johns are having.
Can I help you?
Yeah. I need 3 boxes of a dozen Trojans, 1 regular, 1 ribbed, and 1 lubricated.
Mm-hmm.
A sanitary sponge, 1 KY jelly, 1 Coromex contraceptive cream, and an herbal douche. Oh, and can you fill this prescription for low overall 21?
You don't take any chances, do you?
This filmmaker, Lizzie Borden, that's an assumed name. She was born Linda Elizabeth Borden somewhere in the 1950s. I haven't been able to pin that down with online research. She's a little bit mysterious that way, but as a tween child, she took the name Lizzie to honor Lizzie Borden, the, I think, sort of axe murderer of her father and stepmother from back in the 19th century.
Not sort of. Almost all scholars of the Lizzie Borden case agree that Lizzie Borden was the murderer of her mother and father, and that because she was a upper middle class woman in a mostly working class town whose family had important connections, her guilt was suppressed. There wasn't a good investigation, and she had good attorneys, and the prosecution botched it. There's a very interesting subnote to that, which is the Bordens had a serving maid, an Irish serving maid, and there were widespread rumors that Lizzie and the Irish serving maid were lesbian lovers. I'm sure that the young Lizzie Borden, our filmmaker, when she confronted her parents with her announcement that she was going to change her name legally from Elizabeth Borden to Lizzie Borden, was well aware of the backdrop.
Well, I'm sure that's right. And also the idea of acting against the pressures of what a paternalistic society demands of a young person and on from there. But I also just mean to briefly trace that Lizzie Borden, the filmmaker that we're focused on, she comes of age as a creative in the 1970s in New York City, where she is allied with a lot of folks in the downtown scene, whether they make sculpture, they do poetry, they make photographs, they make movies. She had an earlier feature film, Born in Flames, which is a genuinely weird portrait of a parallel present society where there are different kinds of competing political groups trying to bring greater power to those that are downtrodden. So by the time she makes Working Girls, she's established as a bona fide big fish in a small pond. The unfortunate thing for her professional career afterwards is she never ascended to a larger pond and got greater success. She was always kind of restricted. But at this moment, in 1986, this is a very, very New York movie. She herself, Lizzie Borden, is the writer, the director, the editor, and I think one of its producers. And the movie was assembled for what was then a very small budget. When it's finally brought to market by Miramax Films, which was then relatively new, having only been established in the end of the 1970s and a ways off from the great success it would know in the 1990s, it made a niche for itself by purchasing the rights to distribute documentaries, foreign movies, and weird independent things, especially controversial titles like Working Girls, that it could very carefully place in just the right theaters, in just the right downtown districts, in just the right cities to turn a profit, which this movie managed to do. One of the things about my early jobs in the service economy, I worked in movie theaters, was how boring the job is most of the time. You're just waiting for something to happen, because if people don't come in to purchase your services, to get a seat in the theater, to need popcorn, you are just waiting. And one thing this movie does is grab that attention of these women, sit around a living room and wait. They drink water, they have soda, they make small talk, they thumb magazines. But if nobody's there desiring their services, they earn no money, they're literally wasting their time, and they just wait.
Yeah, it's not really that much different than other kinds of somewhat repetitive office work. You're in a routine, you're expected to follow certain codes of conduct. You often have a boss who is almost tyrannically concerned with you pleasing the customer because they know that it impacts their income as well. I think one of the things that the film does very successfully is it kind of uncovers the banality of sex work. It's also kind of a critique of the industry. It's I think Lizzie Borden's way of saying, look, these women deserve respect. They deserve to be treated decently.
Because Molly's our point of view character, she has a key set of advantages. She does have that Yale education. They describe how she's 30-ish, but not quite there. Now that I'm a good deal older and past that benchmark, it seems impossibly young. But remembering who I was at 16, 18, 20, being 30 did feel like a marker of middle age, of being old. So she has left childhood, she's left young adulthood, she's an educated person, and by being able to quit suggests that she is able to quit. She has some kind of a backup plan. This is not implied, it's explicit. She's a photographer and goes to develop some photographs on her way to her shift at the beginning of the movie. So I presume that she's both supporting her lover and her lover's daughter, and also her nascent creative career by doing work which is very similar to pulling coffee at a Starbucks or bartending. In addition, she is able to let insult largely fall off of her. For instance, there is a new prostitute, Hire, that Lucy brings into the fold in the lengthening afternoon turning into the evening of this one day, who's overtly insulting about lesbians. Because Molly and this woman have been asked to perform together for one of the Johns who wants to enjoy a threesome, but more than that, to watch two women make love. The newbie doesn't particularly dig that. While that's part of Molly's private life, her professional life is largely servicing men, but she's game because it's for pay. It's a role. And she doesn't take on the insult and be offended by the way that this woman calls out a private part of her identity. She just helps guide her through the day's work because it's a way both of them can be tipped out for more money if they do a good job. It's very capitalist. Please the customer.
In the entertainment industry, there are individuals, and indeed often very powerful individuals, who don't really understand or comprehend the full nature of their actions. I think the implications of Miramax, and more particularly the Weinstein brothers, enthusiastically promoting this film of all films it's kind of an astonishing social paradox.
Before we leave Working Girls, an important note about the cinematographer.
Judy Arola was a somebody in the history of American cinematography. She dropped out of school early on. She managed to get a job with KQED, but in 1972, she joined a Marxist film collective. It's hard to imagine these days that such a thing actually existed in the United States, because she was the only woman member of it. And this is after doing work in the Peace Corps in the late 60s. She had already at that time started making little short comedic films for Saturday Night Live, but she didn't have a union card. When Working Girls came out, she is widely celebrated for the very naturalistic and flat camera work. She was basically put in a star chamber by IATSE, the union for, I believe it's the International Association of Theater, Stage and Entertainment Workers, and they tried her. They fined her $4,000. She fought them. She got amnesty, but was still not permitted to join the union. Now, there's a happy ending to this story, which is that she went on to become associate USC School of Cinematic Arts, one of the best film schools in the country, and held a named chair that was funded by Steven Spielberg and George Lucas.
One of the features of our program is pairing the low and the high. And I think, as we've tried to make evident, Working Girls is the high pick for this pairing. And on the low side, maybe against expectation, I put Anora in front of you. Why it's a significant choice and maybe a weird one is because Anora is the Academy Award-winning movie for the year 2024. It was quite exceptional in earning that award.
It's hard for me to imagine someone objecting to such a deeply rich, emotionally resonant film as Anora.
I have a friend from New York who I've been in limited contact with, but we can reach each other. I had not seen Anora when it was originally released. Life was busy that year, and it was a relatively small rollout. This friend did. And she wrote me this, in middle of the night text message to say, this is the kind of movie I believe you would champion and that you would love. And I have to tell you, I think it was awful.
Today this could be the greatest day of our lives.
Anora is released at the Cannes Film Festival. It wins the top award. It spends 5 months getting a distribution arrangement figured out and is released in October 2024. At that time, there are a number of high-profile movies out at the theaters that I'm more familiar with. They include things like A Real Pain and Joker, Folie, Deux, both of which I think are pretty good entertainments. Regardless, Anora is about Anora, or Annie, who is a stripper at a club called the Headquarters, HQ. While there one night, because she has learned to speak Russian due to having a Russian grandmother who never learned to speak English, she's asked to treat a customer at HQ. This is a young man named Vanya, or Ivan. He takes a shine to Annie and keeps seeing her and requests her attention at a party he's throwing for New Year's. She goes, and he proposes that she spend a week with him for pay. They negotiate a price of $15,000, and she becomes his girl for a week. It's very Pretty Woman overlapping to that point. There seems to be a warming of feelings. She seems to like him. He seems to like her. They engage in a lot of substance abuse. They engage in a lot of sex. They go to Las Vegas with a group of his friends, stay at a very high-end suite, and he proposes marriage to her after they both mutually realize he can stay in the United States, never return to Russia, if he can naturalize by marrying an American girl. She proves willing, but she is misguided in her understanding of who her new husband is. The next portion of the movie, roughly its second act, is when the Armenian enforcer of Vanya's Russian father's empire shows up to say, hey, listen, you can't possibly be married to this young woman, and if you are, we have to annul the marriage before your parents show up and do holy hell to me and you because they're not going to accept this experience. Vanya runs away from them, and there becomes this slapdash chase, Odyssey-like, obstacle after obstacle to find Vanya, bring him to the court, and annul this marriage, which requires that they go all the way back to Las Vegas and do it there because it's Nevada and not in New York. All through this mess, this Armenian enforcer, Toros, who's a longtime Sean Baker collaborator, a guy named Karen Karagulian, he has a second, a guy named Igor, played by Yura Borisov. Igor is there to be muscle, but he's also sort of humane and looks after Ani increasingly with a sense of something like attraction. And in the end of the movie, he is the one who brings her home and gives her her things, including the wedding ring that was taken from her when Vanya's parents do indeed show up and force the annulment, which destroys a kind of fantasy about what her future might be. She rewards Igor with a come on in the car, where she starts to give him sex, and then it all collapses when he attempts to kiss her because there appears to be an honest form of affection, whereupon she breaks down into tears, and he consoles her with a hug, and we go to credits and a silent screen as we read who the cast and crew were. I've oversold some of the details, but for fully the first 40 minutes of this movie, which runs almost 2 hours and 20 minutes of overall length, it's just hijinks and fun, while we watch Ani and Vanya sort of fall in love and enjoy having extraordinary wealth from Vanya's parents to throw around at whatever they wish. That's followed by an hour and a half of difficulty and complication, which begins with a kind of a home invasion when Toros, the Armenian enforcer, shows up with his henchmen to get Vanya back to the court, but Vanya escapes. In the middle of all that happening, they literally tie down Annie as she's screaming at them to let her go, and it becomes this tension between, is this funny or is this pre-rape? Is this violation or something I have permission to laugh at? And that tension runs through the whole movie. That tension is, I think, what drove my friend Batty. I don't think that she likes hanging out with the kinds of people in Brooklyn that we're largely hanging out with. The accent that is involved, the sort of Russian chauvinism that is involved in these characters as things move along. And for myself, I also feel a little bit repulsed by the way these characters sound. It all hinges on whether you like the central star, and that is Mikey Madison, who has a modest but real career in movies and a modest but real career in television, and at the tender age of, I think, 24, was cast in this role, where she needed to learn conversational Russian, where she needed to learn not just conversational, but useful striptease to pass herself as an actual sex worker in a place like the headquarters. She does all of that really well. But the thing that I find disagreeable is it's irritating to listen to her talk. But that also proves that she does have a way of being a very specific New York type, just one that I find a little unpleasant.
You're talking to somebody who lived in New York, in the greater New York City area for 25 years, who spent a lot of time living in Brooklyn. Now, I want to say something about your friend's response, calling you up and saying, or writing you in the middle of the night and saying, nothing really happens in this movie. It's offensive. It makes light of important sexual political issues like rape. I think that's a category misunderstanding. There is a collection of Shakespearean plays, and they're often referred to as the mystery plays. And depending on which critic is doing the talking, they usually include things like Twelfth Night, A Winter's Tale, and All's Well That Ends Well. The mystery plays of Shakespeare have this odd quality of insanely funny moments, but also being deeply serious and emotional. And I would say that Anora is very much a part of this typology. It's a mystery film. There are extremely funny laugh out loud moments on it. There are brilliant beats. Several of the actors basically play what in Shakespearean terms would be called clowns or buffoons, specifically the Armenian enforcers, Taurus and Garnick, who at one point vomits all over the SUV, the collection writing in. I mean, they're clowns. Your friend's reaction is very understandable. And when you recommended it to me, I was basically totally unfamiliar with it. It's not the sort of film that normally would attract my attention. Now I would say that I would give it the highest rating. And the reason why is what I think happens is it sets up your expectations about what's supposed to happen, and then very, very skillfully and shrewdly undermines them. I was watching the film and I was going, this is basically a remake of Pretty Woman, which I think, in fact, it's a critique of. The extravagance, the opulence, and the excess of drug use, of spending, of partying without any kind of purpose, it verges on nauseating. Yet, as you follow Annie, you begin to identify with her more and more. I think it's that quality, which again is very Shakespearean, right? In the mystery plays, the heroine is almost always the protagonist is almost always a woman who often is in many ways more forceful and masculine than the men around her. I think that's one of the many magical things about Anora.
I think it's possible that is exactly what my buddy was not interested in looking at, because superficially, you're watching a young woman who is our point of view character, and as you point out, is being brought into a world of such opulence that it's sort of stunning. A detail, at the very end of the movie, just before the ultimate confrontation between Igor and Annie in the car when she breaks down crying, she awakens in the last night she's allowed to stay in that big estate, looking out over the bay where it has this wonderful view as snow has begun to fall. She's standing there gazing upon this absolutely majestic scene that only certain spots on planet Earth can provide a person, and she has an exclusive view all by her lonesome in a gigantic plate glass window, and we're looking at it over her shoulder. That level of comfort and of beauty is part of the world that she feels she might be able to connect with, touch, and in fact occupy if only this dummy, Vanya, is true to his word. The pain she experiences is he can't be. He's too weak a personality, and he's under the thumb of his Russian oligarch father, yet we are confronted by that really incredible kind of beauty.
And it attracts these seemingly very strong, but as it turns out, rather weak men who flock around her in the film. And she dominates these infinitely more powerful and much physically stronger men around her. The one real confrontation she has is with Vanya's mother, who comes from Russia to get her son divorced from this woman who she regards as a common street whore. And it's a scene that's so intense and so funny that Nikolai Zakharov, the Russian oligarch who's Vanya's father, bursts out laughing when he actually sees a 23-year-old woman treating his Gorgon of a wife in a way that he obviously feels she deserves.
Goodbye, America.
Okay.
Anora, I think, is using the character of Anora as a way to take apart this huge divergence between not just wealth, but unimaginable wealth that the oligarchs of the world, whether they're from Russia or Silicon Valley, the vastness of their capital is so far beyond the imaginings of a common person that we're asked to participate in the world only when the welcome mat is rolled out for us, and when it's rolled away, we're treated like trash, as Anora is. Another part that appeals to me about how the movie changes tones, because there are moments of exquisite energy. There are these wonderful locations where they go visit things. You mentioned the clowns, the Armenians that are in the employ of the Zakharov family. We're meant to see them as menacing characters. You know, they're in winter coats, they're big men.
There's a way in which Toros, who is first seen baptizing a baby at an Eastern Orthodox, or participating in the baptism of a baby in an Eastern Orthodox service. And then he has to leave, and clearly he lives on the Zakharov's tailcoats. He's got to go and do these things. And yet he constantly apologizes everywhere he goes. He behaves badly. He ties Annie up. He then forces her to go around looking for Vanya at all these various places where he abuses people. He smashes a candy store, and he's constantly apologizing. And then there's his sort of second in command, Varnik, another Armenian, who within moments of meeting him, Annie
Kicks him in the
face and breaks his nose. This is a very impressive moment, which gets all of the men's attention.
One thing that is in common between these two movies we've paired, Working Girls and Anora, is while they are a description of a part of the sex industry, this is a world where women are the thing that's being traded, but they have a role in trading because they allow themselves to be traded, at least in these depictions. I think it would be different if it were strung out, drug-addicted individuals on a Los Angeles street. That's a different kind of a movie, a different kind of a story, a different kind of reality. This is a more selected experience that we're examining, and one that is more open to forms of heroism, the kinds of things that you are celebrating in your commentary about Anora's unwieldy behaviors towards these men. That extended sequence of the, quote, home invasion, unquote, when Vanya runs off, leaving Ani in the gigantic house surrounded by these three men who take turns trying to subdue her, and they really can't until they hit upon, we've got to tie her.
They tie her up, they gag her. Igor, who in many ways turns out to be the real romantic protagonist of the film, holds her in his lap in a way that looks kind of like vulgar and threatening, but he doesn't see it that way because he just doesn't think in those terms.
Right. It's the only way to keep her head from knocking him in the face. And it's the only way to keep his legs around her body and to keep her hands from punching him, which she's already done successfully. And he admires it. He even says so while this is happening. She reads it, as I think a reasonable person would, as a form of assault that could lead to rape. And he's reading it as, I have to do what I'm told, or I'm in trouble, and I can't get in trouble. So I need to make this small woman be still.
Anyone who reads about Eastern European culture in the West knows that, especially the Russian organized crime world, is unbelievably brutal. We have a number of fine films about this. There's David Cronenberg's Eastern Promises. There's Leaving Las Vegas, in which a beautiful woman played by Elizabeth Shue, who manages to somehow befriend and fall in love with a dying alcoholic, played by Nicolas Cage, is basically owned by these astonishingly brutal Russian pimps. It's a well-known trope, and I think an accurate one. You wonder how ignorant Annie is about just male behavior. I mean, she's a woman who manipulates and lap dances. She's not a Yale graduate the way that Molly in Working Girls is, but she's obviously a very street smart young woman, and she should know better than to think that this really silly, almost infantile, overgrown child of a character, Ivan Zarkov, is remotely a good candidate for marriage. Yet she somehow lets herself and her own inner fantasies get drawn into this. The things that are left in the background, the unstated but for me very explicit issues, are, how do the Zarkovs make their money? At one point early in the film, Vanya shows Annie the Wikipedia entry on his father. And you wonder what that Wikipedia entry says, but he's obviously part of Putin's inner circle. By the time this film is made, the war in Ukraine is already underway, and none of this gets played out.
It's okay. Just put it. Oh! Stop! Please stop! Stop, please!
The final image of the movie, of Annie's emotional collapse, it's very tender. It's very painful. And a lot of awards consideration probably rested on that moment. And I found myself quite overcome with it because I was worried about what it is responding to in particular. What I think I'm watching her cry for is the way that she talked herself into a fantasy of what might be possible. And when she realizes it's not, it's painful. I counter that because in Working Girls, what Molly gives up by saying, I'm not coming back, and presumably she has left behind working as a prostitute, at least at Lucy's apartment, we know that she's going back to what appears to be a loving relationship. Annie has not yet gotten to a point when she has any of that material. She's in a spot where she's blocked out of those kinds of comforts, and for a few days' time, being paid $15,000 by Vanya, she thought, maybe I have found a boy turning into a man and I can shape him, but also get rid of these material discomforts of being a young woman who's exploiting her body for gain, but only getting ahead just enough. And the thing about Igor attempting to kiss her is a reminder that he, like her, is trading on the youth of his body, the vitality of his ability to be muscle. For these Armenians who are using him to threaten people, he's eventually going to outgrow that too. And what he can look forward to is the tenderness and potential connection with somebody who can see him as a person worth remembering. And he has remembered her and her value, first, by bringing her home safely after they get off to a rough start with that home invasion, and then taking her luggage upstairs to the stoop of her home, and finally giving her the wedding ring that had been taken from her finger to dissolve and annul the marriage that she willfully went into and thought was legally binding. He returns all of that to her, demonstrating a kind of a connection between these two hardscrabble kids who are much more appropriate for each other, but the fantasy must be burned away first, thus she cries.
If you watch Igor carefully, you sense from the moment he hits the screen that he is interested in Annie. I find the final scene maybe one of the most romantic scenes in cinema, because Annie, after having fought with and obviously understood but rejected Igor's admiration and affection throughout the entire movie, suddenly decides she's going to reward him. She gets into his lap, and then he reaches up and places his hands on her face and tries to bring her face down and his face up to hers to kiss her, and she starts to slap and beat him. He doesn't try and force her to kiss him, and then she bursts out in tears and collapses into his arm. Any street smart woman who thought that Vanya just plays video games and does massive amounts of substances is a good bet for a marriage is obviously stupid. And I think that Annie, at the end of the film, realizes that she's been playing outside of her league. Igor, is basically become her bodyguard. And then at the end, where she finally realizes how much he's given to her, she tries to reward him in the only way that she knows possible, which is to give him sex. He responds by wanting to kiss her, which upsets her because obviously she realizes that she's wasted an enormous amount of emotional energy and humiliated and embarrassed herself with this man-child, Vanya, who's not remotely capable of responding to her. And suddenly here's this, he announces that the entire day that we witnessed before was actually his 30th birthday. It's a very touching moment. Annie looks at him and goes, "Really? It's like your 30th birthday?" And he says, "Yeah, my 30th birthday."
It's good of you to remind me of these details. While I have just seen the movie, they're not right in the front of my thinking, but these reminders are helping me put together the final scene more in the way that you're suggesting. That really, Igor's a stand-up dude caught in a circumstance where he's made to be the heavy, but he's not. The filmmaker Sean Baker, who's I think made something like 8 or 10 movies by now, he's in his middle 50s, and he has an overlarge fascination with people who work in the sex industry. Several of his movies focus on different components of adult entertainment, however you wish to define that, because it's one of his stated beliefs that that's a completely legitimate way for a person to go earn money. And we shouldn't have shame attached to it. There shouldn't be illegality attached to it. It shouldn't be turned into criminal enterprise when consenting adults are consenting to a behavior that rewards one with a certain sort of emotional and physical satisfaction and gives the other the reward of earning money. But this story of Anora could have been entirely set in a PG environment and worked its way through to still deliver the impact of Igor's concluding kindness, I guess I want to say. So you're right to point out those details. I had left them out of my front thinking.
There is a moment in the final and very, I think, instructive dialogue between Annie and Igor. He says something to the effect that he wanted to protect her, and she says, "Nah, you wanted to rape me." He says, "Why do you say that?" And she said, "You have rapist eyes." And he says,
"But I didn't want to rape you."
Oh, yeah? Why?
What?
Why?
What, why?
Why wouldn't you have raped me?
Because I'm not a rapist.
Two things about the final scene. One is that the night before, Igor has told Annie how much he prefers her name,
right,
Nora. And he says, well, it represents He looks it up. He Googles it on his phone, and he's like, "Well, it means light and warrior." And she says, "Yeah, I don't like it." But he says, "Well, I like Anora." What is the movie called? It's not called Annie.
Yeah.
Which tells you that Igor's decision about her name and her personality is really where the film stakes its ground, where it actually says, this is who she actually is. She's made a bad but understandable decision. She's been swept up in the romance and the fairy tale. Then there's this guy, Igor. He treats her with respect. He protects her like a chivalric knight.